This is English shorthand dictation number 204 and the dictation speed is 140 words per minute. Ready? Start. I do not think it would be necessary for me to take much time off the House in order to command this measure to the honourable members. The main provisions of the bill are three. First, the bill seeks to give compensation to workmen who may become victims of war injuries. Second, the bill seeks to make employers liable for such compensation. And third, the bill seeks to compel employers to insure against liabilities imposed upon them. Now, taking the question of compensation, the point to which I wish to draw the attention of the House is that this bill is a linked measure. It is linked to Workmen's Compensation Act. Now, sir, the relationship of this bill to the War Injuries Ordinance to which I have made a reference is plain. As honourable members will recall, the War Injuries Ordinance defines what is called the qualifying injuries. Those injuries are classified in that ordinance. What the present bill does is to adopt the scope and limits of the qualifying injuries as has been defined in the War Injuries Ordinance. As to the question of relationship of the present bill to the Workmen's Compensation Act, that will be clear to the honourable members from the fact that the amount of compensation which has been fixed in this bill for the victim of war injuries more or less follows the scale that has been fixed in the Workmen's Compensation Act. Now, sir, the reason for bringing this measure is this. After the War Injuries Ordinance was passed, a question was raised whether the payment made to a workman who unfortunately happened to sustain what is called the qualifying injuries should be a sort of relief or should be compensation. The difference between relief and compensation is quite obvious. Relief is merely to help a person to get over the difficulties to which he might be reduced by reason of the incapacity which he suffers by a war injury and which prevents him from earning normal wages. On the other hand, compensation, according to the terms of the Workmen's Compensation Act, seeks to make payment which compensates him fully for the loss which he incurs. When this question was raised, a reference was made to the conditions that were prevailing in England, and it was found that the British Parliament passed an enactment which is known as the War Injuries Miscellaneous Act. On examination of the provisions of this English law, it was found that the payments which were allowed under that act amounted to compensation and not merely relief. Obviously, the question arose whether it was not desirable for the Government of India to follow the principle which was laid down in this English statute. Secondly, some of the employers on their own accord, after the passing of the War Injuries Ordinance, addressed a letter to the Government of India stating that from their point of view the provisions made in the War Injuries Ordinance were not sufficient for the maintenance of the morale of labour and that compensation should be paid in order that the labourers working in disturbed areas may remain steady at that work. From both these points of view, the Government of India accepted the principle of giving compensation to workmen in place of what was originally thought to be only relief. On examining the provisions of the War Injuries Ordinance, it was found that at a level of about ₹24, the payments made under the War Injuries Ordinance constituted not only relief but also compensation. What is therefore necessary to do is to give the workman some additional rebate which will make payments made to him amount to compensation. That means to supplement what he gets under the ordinance so that what he will get will also amount to compensation. This measure therefore is a measure which is a supplementary measure which supplements the provisions of War Injuries Ordinance. Having explained to the House the main provision of compensation and how the bill was linked up to the War Injuries Ordinance as well as to the Workmen's Compensation Act, and having explained to the House the reason which led the Government of India to bring in this supplementary legislation, I will proceed to explain the second main provision of the bill, namely to make the employer liable for such compensation. It might be said that while under the provisions of the War Injuries Ordinance, it was the government which was undertaking the liability to pay relief, the government should also undertake similar liability for making compensation to those to whom this present bill applies. It is quite obvious that it is not possible for the government to undertake the liability which under the circumstances of the case may almost amount to anything. If India remains as it is, there may be no liability arising out of this. If the situation worsens, the liability may be quite indefinite, and having regard to the capacity of the government of India, it is quite obvious that the government cannot be asked to undertake such indefinite liability. Secondly, I do not think that much can be made of the fact that the government of India is not undertaking liability in this matter, for it will be realized that whatever amount of compensation the employer may be called upon to pay under the liability which we are imposing upon him, it would be regarded as an admissible revenue expenditure, and consequently the burden would ultimately fall upon the treasury. I might also mention that while the government of India is seeking to impose this liability upon the employers, the government of India is not forgetting its own obligations to its own employees. Honorable members will find a clause there stating that this bill does not apply to the servants of the Crown or to the employees of the Federal Railway. But that does not mean that these employees are not going to get the benefit similar to those which we are providing in this bill. I should like to inform the House that the Federal Railways as well as the Government of India have informed their employees that they would be prepared to extend the provisions of extra pensions which are contained in the Civil Service Regulations and in the statutory rules governing the employment of railwaymen. Now, sir, the third provision which seeks to compel the employer to ensure the liability imposed upon him is a very necessary and a very salutary provision. The object of making this provision is to ensure that the workmen at all times will get the compensation for which this bill seeks to make provision. It may be that if a factory is bombed or demolished, the assets of an employer are destroyed, and if any provision of the sort that is sought to be made in this bill is in existence, notwithstanding the benefit which the Act extends to the workmen, it may in the final analysis leave the workmen where they are without any opportunity of getting compensation which is provided for. Insurance, therefore, is guaranteed to the workman that in all circumstances the benefits which the bill seeks to give him will be there for him if he receives the war injury. The working of the system will be somewhat as follows. The payment will be made by the employer to the employee in the first instance in regard to the terms of the bill. The employer will be reimbursed out of an insurance fund which may be managed by the government. The employer will contribute to this insurance fund the premium which will be settled at the end of the war when the total liability will be known. In the meanwhile, the government will be recovering advances from employers against the final premium which will be settled after the war. The quantum of advance will vary from quarter to quarter. In the first quarter, the advance will not exceed 25% of the wage bill. For subsequent quarters, it will change depending upon the liability that may be outstanding. It may be that there have been no casualties in the preceding quarter. If that is so, it is obvious that no advances will be recovered from the employer.